Hello, I'm Joshua Sparrow, Executive Director of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, and this is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. To find out more about the Brazelton Touchpoint Center and Learning to Listen, just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on the Offerings tab or the Webinars tab. Today, we will be listening to Professor Loretta J. Ross and learning how she listens and calls in across differences. We are incredibly fortunate to have her join us today, and you will soon see why. But first, a bit of information about today's Learning to Listen episode. Over 3,500 people from around the country and the world registered for today's webinar. I love to see all of your names, what you do and where you are, from Alaska to Florida and around the world. So do tell us who you are and where you're from in the chat. And to accommodate everyone who would like to join, you can watch today's Learning to Listen on our Facebook page if you're having difficulty viewing the webinar on this Zoom platform. Just search for the Brazelton Touchpoint Center in Facebook, and you'll see that the live stream video will be pinned to the top of our page. Now today, once again, our wonderful interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, joining us all the way from Bogota, Colombia, will be simultaneously translating our webinar in Spanish. Thank you so much once again, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls that should appear at the bottom of your screen, and then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, all you have to do is select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español y inglés. En los controles de su reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo español, haga clic en Silenciar Audio Original. And if you've got a comment or a question, put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to pause a few times long before the end to take a look and see what you're wondering about, what you're thinking. And if you've got a technical issue, please go ahead and put that into the chat box, and we'll do all we can to try to help you out. And remember, if you'd like to receive a certificate of attendance, just be sure you complete the feedback survey. You'll see the survey open up in your browser when the webinar ends today, and you'll also receive a link in the survey that we'll send out tomorrow to you. It's a thank you email. You'll have the link to the webinar recording, and the survey will be there so that you can receive the certificate of attendance if you like. And you can also access the recording on our YouTube channel and our website. Now, before we begin, I want to be sure to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, and our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Nina Zumpalova, Ashley Gaddis, Michael Accardi, and Suzanne Okasik. And now, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Loretta J. Ross, who is professor in the program for the study of women and gender at Smith College. Professor Ross teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. Professor Ross co-created the theory of reproductive justice in 1994 and has dedicated much of her career to health and reproductive justice for women of color. She has served as executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, national program director of the National Black Women's Health Project, national coordinator of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and they've got a really cool website for you to check out, and national co-director of the March for Women's Lives, which was in Washington in 2004. As a self-described radical Black feminist, Professor Ross is also an activist and public intellectual, and has written tons of articles and chapters and books, including 3 books on reproductive justice: Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice. Another is Reproductive Justice, an Introduction. And another is Radical Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, Practice, Critique. And she's got a new book coming out next year, and we're kind of going to get a preview of that today, that will be called Calling in the Calling Out Culture. coming out in 2022. So, Professor Ross, and I think you said it was okay for me to call you Loretta as long as I'm over 12 years old. And I hope you'll call me Josh. Thank you so much for being with us. We are so fortunate to have you here to share your work and wisdom. And one of the many powerful things about your work, as I've been reading you, is the way you so generously share your own reflections on what living your own life has been teaching you. So I thought maybe we could begin with your story and your why.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I have no problems in telling my story because it informs everything that I think I know right now. I mean, obviously, your lived experiences aren't a preparatory school, as a writer said, but it can give you an opportunity to actually develop wisdom. And that's what I hope that I've done. I'm from Texas. My father was in the military. We moved around quite a bit. I went through first grade in 3 different states. But when he retired, we moved to Texas. Excuse me. And so, mom was a Southern evangelical Christian woman. And life proceeded pretty routinely, except for bouncing between military and civilian schools, up until the age of 14. At that time, I had a cousin, older married cousin, who was 27 years old, who was supposed to babysit me, but he thought it'd be a better idea to get me drunk so that he could have sex with me. And that was an unfortunate way of discovering rape and incest because it certainly affected my life. That was in the 1960s. So when predictably I became pregnant as a result of the incest, abortion was not an option. And so my only choice was whether or not to keep the child at the end of the pregnancy or not. I gave birth in a Catholic hospital, and what they were supposed to do was whisk the baby away so that I would never meet the child. Because my parents and I had agreed that at 14, this is not the way you want to become a mother under those conditions. But because it was at a Catholic hospital, they broke protocol and they caught my son after he was born. And when they put him in my arms, I kept saying, he's got my face. He's got my face. Oh my God, he's got my face. And so then I couldn't go through with the adoption. Everything changed after that. I went from being a scared pregnant teen to a mother. And fortunately for me, my parents glommed all over my son as if it was their idea because, they went from parents and grandparents like in a heartbeat. And so that enabled me to graduate high school because this all happened the summer before my 10th grade year. And eventually accept the scholarship to Howard University. I actually had a scholarship before then to Radcliffe College. But what Radcliffe withdrew their scholarship offer when they'd heard I'd had a baby because I wasn't the right kind of student they wanted in 1970. They couldn't withdraw the admission, but they could withdraw the scholarship. So fortunately for me, I had another scholarship to Howard University, so that's where I went. I majored in chemistry and physics because I am a nerd, a proud nerd, as a matter of fact, thinking that I was going to end up doing physical inorganic research in a laboratory somewhere. But my plumbing kept getting in the way. And I became pregnant in my first year of college. This time, at least the sex was voluntary with my law school boyfriend. He was in his first year of law school when I was a first year student. And so he was more than happy to help me out. And fortunately for me, Washington, D.C. legalized abortion in the summer of 1970, and I needed one in the spring of 71. And so I was able to go have a perfectly safe and legal abortion at the Washington Hospital Center, which, as I said, my boyfriend was more than happy to pay for. But my problem wasn't legal or financial, but familial, because my mother didn't approve of abortion. She thought that the best plan for me would be to drop out of college and come home and raise not only the baby she was already taking care of, but the twins that I was expecting. I didn't agree with that plan. To be 16 and parenting 3 kids was not on my agenda. And so, fortunately, because I was under 18 and I needed parental consent, my big sister signed the permission form, forged my mother's name to it. And that allowed me to have an abortion at 16. And one of the things that informs my activism now was that it was easier to have an abortion back then than it is now if you're underage, because of the increasing restrictions on abortion. That we can't protect children from childhood sexual abuse, but we then want to punish them for being victims kind of approach. Well, after that, I sought a more long-term form of birth control and accepted implantation of an IUD, an intrauterine device that was called the Dalcon Shield. Unfortunately, it was a defectively designed IUD, and it led to me being sterilized when I was 23. So my entire reproductive career was 7 years, a full birth, an abortion, and a sterilization. And so that's what led me in 1994 to work with a group of 11 other Black women and, and define the theory of reproductive justice, which is the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent the children that we have in safe and healthy environments. And so to sum up my life, I say that my plumbing dictated my choices. It wasn't like I wanted to major in chemistry and physics and then never use that stuff. That's hard stuff to never use. I think I had to take organic chemistry twice because I couldn't get that nomenclature right.
Well, and let me point out that you slipped in that you were 16 and you were in college already. So,
Well, yeah, because
yeah.
I bounced between civilian and military schools, I got skipped from the 2nd grade to the 5th grade.
Oh, wow.
Because military schools just offered more competent education, not because I was particularly smart, I don't think,
Well,
but I
I
was
disagree
always
with you on
too
that.
young for my classmates, and that also made me particularly vulnerable, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the things about the reproductive justice framing work that you and your colleagues did back then, as I understand it, was you looked at this binary, this sort of splitting of pro-life or pro-choice, and thought that kind of doesn't really get us to the place we want to get to. And I think in reframing it as reproductive justice, where you combined a couple of things to do something more connected and less kind of cut up into two pieces, it seems sort of like what you're trying to do with calling out the cancel culture and calling in, because you're also trying to get us to a better place through the ways in which we communicate. So tell me if I've got that right, and tell us about how you came upon cancel culture and what it looked like to you and why you decided you need to do something about it.
Well, I have to blame it all on my grandson. When he was about 10 years old, he was the only 10-year-old apparently in America that didn't know how to answer his cell phone. And finally, when I called him out on it, he said, "Well, Grandma, just, get on Facebook, and that's the way you can talk to me." So I got on Facebook, and the minute I got on Facebook, he migrated off to Instagram or Snapchat saying it was for old fogies. But I stayed on Facebook because it was a way to connect to people. It was back when we could use Facebook productively that way. And I noticed how mean people were being to each other on social media. And I was pretty astonished because I hadn't paid any particular attention to the toxicity of what was happening online. And so when I asked another young person, what's going on here? She said, oh, you mean the call out culture? I said, y'all named it? She said, yeah. I said, well, what are y'all doing about it? And
Hmm.
she shrugged her shoulders and walked away. But that began me thinking about whether I had something that I could contribute to the conversation. When I was 25, I became director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. And as a rape survivor, I went to a prison and taught Black feminist theory to men who had been incarcerated for raping and murdering Black women. And that was my first calling in experience where I had to overcome my abject fear of Black male rapists that I had directly experienced and still, based on my ego or my curiosity, figure out if I could talk to men to have a conversation about how to end violence against women. And so I did that at 25, probably made lot of mistakes. They probably laughed at my naivete, but at the same time, what I learned about myself was that I had the capacity to have difficult conversations with the most unlikely and unpromising people.
You
And
know,
I enjoyed that.
you know, you I saw somewhere that you actually ended up communicating with one gentleman who'd been incarcerated and who I think had been convicted of rape, who had had a lot of time for a lot of reflection and came across your work and reached out to you um, for help, with his struggle. And yeah, as I listen to you, I'm also thinking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and one writer, Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who talked about having to face um, uh, someone at the top of the apartheid machine who was imprisoned at the end of apartheid, and that same kind of fear of being face to face um, with that person and the things that he'd done. And I think in both those stories, there's something about the rehumanizing what's been dehumanized. And in reading your work, it seems to me that that's part of what you're trying to help us to understand and move us towards.
I would agree. As a matter of fact, speaking of South Africa, I had a chance to interview members of the Africana resistance movement
Mm.
when I was monitoring hate groups and fighting fascists. And I wanted to see their potential for threatening the democratic transition in South Africa. So I spent a lot of time in South Africa over the years. And I remember General Viljoen, I think that's how his name is pronounced, because he was the founder of the AWB. And yeah, I've had a lot of unlikely conversations, as I say, with the most improbable cast of characters in my life. And to do so, there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind. First of all, people who have suffered tremendous injustice don't expect to be listened to. They don't expect to be heard. And I found that out with the incarcerated men who wrote me and said, outside I raped women, inside I rape men. We'd like not to be rapists anymore. And that struck my heart. And then I found that once I listened to them, I couldn't dehumanize them anymore. The same when I've deprogrammed people in the fascist movement or the hate movement. Once you see them as human beings, it's very hard to hate them still because most human beings just want to do the right thing, raise their families, live in peace and security, contribute something to society on all sides of the political divide. I mean, there's really very few psychopaths out there or sociopaths. And so if you can put into your mental parking lot your reaction to their identity and many times to their political beliefs, and pay attention to the humanity that we all have, you'll have some awesome conversations with people that you didn't think were possible.
So tell us about how you go about calling in and how you distinguish it from calling out.
Well, we all know what calling out is. That's just publicly shaming and blaming and humiliating people for something you think they've done wrong. It's a way to achieve accountability, at least you hope it is. Well, a calling in is a calling out done with love. You're still seeking accountability, but instead of inviting people to a fight, you're inviting them into a conversation. And so a classic calling in sentence would be, that's an interesting perspective. Tell me more. And that invitation to tell you more is something a lot of people don't expect to get when they know you disagree with them. But when you invite people into a conversation, you don't have to agree with them to offer them radical love and respect and acknowledge their humanity and their right to have an opinion that is different from yours. And I find that when you do that, the results will surprise you. I've had anti-abortionists picket a conference that I was organizing. I went out there and talked to them. 4 of the 5 came inside and joined us. As I said, I've talked to ex-members of the Klan and the neo-Nazi movement. I talked to a lot of difficult people, and or what somebody might define as difficult people, but I find that most people are better inside. They have better opinions of themselves internally than they sometimes exhibit externally. And so my job is to build up that internal compassion muscle that they all have, so that that's what they lead with instead of the opinions or words that sometimes come out of their mouths.
I know you're probably not able to read the chat at the same time, but I have to tell you, people are just loving you and what you're saying, and I think are so nourished and supported by being here with you. We have lots of people who work in healthcare, lots of people work in early childhood care and education, and there's one question about how to do this with people who are refusing to be vaccinated. So here's a question. I feel the urgency to call out people who continue to refuse to get vaccinated. And I know there are people who are directors of childcare centers, for example, where it's all kinds of real problems right there in the moment. So the questioner goes on to say, vaccination has become so political, and it seems that many people are not willing to listen to the other side. So any tips on calling in instead?
I haven't had any conversations with any anti-vaccination people. Fortunately, I'm not surrounded by them. I'm a senior citizen. I'm surrounded by a bunch of geriatric people who rush to get vaccinated as opposed to delay. So that's my social circle. But I can imagine having a conversation with one if one ever appeared on my radar. I'd keep my mask on, obviously, and I would ask them who they care about and how they would like to be seen by the people that they care about. As someone who's going to do everything they in their power to keep them safe, even if they don't know it's going to work. Would they want to risk being wrong for the people they care about? Is being right about whether the vaccine is for you, then being wrong and the risk to them more important to you? You get to decide how you're going to appear in the lives of the people who love you and who you love. And so that would be one way I'd start the conversation. Do you want your children to have the impression that you will do everything in your power to protect them? Or do you want your children to have the opinion that their lives don't matter because you're standing on a political hill and you don't care who dies from your opinion.
Yeah, and that gets to something else that you've also been really clear about, which is there are sometimes some people, some places where calling out is actually the thing to do. And so I wanted to make sure that we took the time so that you could sort of make that distinction about when is that the thing to do.
Well, I'm a member of the human rights movement, and we always call people out. That's our favorite tactic. I mean, we call out governments that abuse people's human rights. We call out politicians that abuse their power and authority or, are corrupt. We call out individuals who abuse people's human rights. So that's our best tactic when the entity we're calling out is capable of feeling public shame. But we just endured a president who was shameless. The more we called out President Trump, the more his followers liked it, and the more he liked the attention. So calling out was not a very useful tactic for President Trump, for example. And so I'm not saying that we should take calling out of the toolbox. I'm saying that we should be more precise with our aim. Because when you're dealing with a lot of individuals, for example, if someone thinks that they're going to be piled upon and pilloried for what they've done or said or they believe, chances are you're not going to get accountability by calling them out. They're going to double down, deny the harm that they've done, fail to apologize, and keep doing whatever they think is they need to do. And so if your goal is to get that person to change their behavior, belief, or words that they're saying, calling in actually increases the possibility that you'll get what you want because you're already signaling that you're going to respect them, that you're going to give them a chance to offer their points of view, participate and stay in the conversation, like keeping a seat at the table. You're not going to kick them out for disagreeing with you. That actually offers them a chance to self-reflect and to decide, often for the first time, how they want to walk through the world and how they want to be in relationship to you. And so if accountability is your goal, calling in increases its probability, or calling out decreases its probability. Because when you call somebody out, you've invited them to a fight, not a conversation.
But we have some feedback here. I apologize for that. You've also said that trying to accomplish all that with calling in needs not to become a burden on someone who's been injured or harmed. So I wondered, I think when you've written about that, you've been trying to sort of protect against the misunderstanding that the burden for calling in and necessarily having access in that moment to that compassion muscle should fall on the person who has been injured, or that it would be that person's job necessarily to help the person who did the injuring to learn and grow. So I wondered if you could sort of speak to that, because there are questions about this in the chat about this is hard to get through.
Well, the person who has suffered the injury has no obligation to help her abuser or his abuser. I mean, that person's number one priority should be to see to their own healing. And so, no, I'm not saying that if you're a rape victim, you need to go out there and start trying to call in rapists. No, that would be an overly simplification and a misinterpretation of what I'm saying. But calling in is a choice that you get to make because the first person you have to call in is yourself. Calling in is what you do for yourself, not what you do for somebody else. Calling in yourself requires making sure that you're in a sufficiently healed enough space to build a container to have this conversation with someone else. See to your own healing so that you can see if you have the resilience and the bandwidth to make that kind of gracious offering to someone else. Let me quote someone badly that I truly learned a great lesson from. Chris Singleton's mother was killed when those 9 church people down in Charleston, South Carolina were killed back in 2015, I think it was. And his mother was one of the people that white supremacist killed. And in the newspaper, I read that Chris had written this analysis. He said, a lot of people think that if you practice forgiveness, that you're actually being weak. But in fact, forgiveness is a sign of strength because you're letting go of anger, of revenge. You're not letting the person who harmed you dictate the destiny of your life. You're recapturing your dignity. You're recapturing your power when you forgive. And so forgiveness in that vein is what you do for yourself, not what you do for someone else. I don't think Chris was saying that because he cared about what happened to the murderer. He did it because he cared about what happened to his memory of his mother. And when it's stated like that, I learned so much from the power of forgiveness and how it works to help one heal, even if the person who you are forgiving doesn't know it took place or is indifferent to it. And calling in like accountability, like forgiveness, is the kind of thing you do to protect your own dignity and integrity. Because your reputation is what everybody else thinks they know about you, but your integrity is what you know about yourself. And you should spend your time and energy protecting your own integrity with joy, because you'll never be able to actually protect your own reputation. I mean, people see you through the lens of their lived experiences, and you don't have any control over that. And so it's futile to even pursue, oh, I'm going to do this so I'll look good, or that they'll think well of me, and all of that kind of stuff. You don't know what's going on with other people, but you do know what you think about yourself. And you should be consistently making decisions that you can look in the eye without shame and regret. And that's what I call protecting your integrity. And that's what Chris spoke to me when I read his comments in the newspaper.
You used the word accountability, and you talked about the misunderstanding that forgiveness signals weakness, whereas in fact, it is a part of the process of reclaiming strength and dignity. How can you help clarify where some of the misunderstanding is about forgiveness somehow being incompatible with holding accountable?
Well, I guess because I'm so old school, I can forgive and not forget,
Mm.
and so I can forgive what has been done to me, but I can also work very hard not to recreate the conditions that allow that thing to be done to me again. That's forgiving without forgetting. So I'm not saying develop instant amnesia, because that's not something that will work in your interest. Matter of fact, as a survivor of trauma, I find that the memory does its own amnesia so you can survive. The memory will take care of that, because that's kind of how the brain is wired. So it's not about that quick forgiveness that you do for others, or I guess the best way it works for me is that I don't like to think that I'm going to permanently shut out of my life everybody with the capacity to harm me,
Mm.
because there's a whole lot of people that can harm me, including starting with my parents. They gave the worst wounds sometimes, but I don't want to shut them out of my life. And so understanding that because you've been hurt in the past, there's no reason to shut down, because you're still going to be hurt, whether or not you make yourself available to be in relationship with people or not. But having control over your destiny, having control over the choices that you make, that to me is the real sense of self-determination of power and power. I mean, after my cousin, like I said, impregnated me, my mother made an observation about me. And you know, your mom can always peep you in a way that you don't even know about yourself when you're a teenager, right? And so when she sent me off to college, she said, Loretta, one thing I've always admired about you is that you don't let success go to your head. And I said, oh, Mom, shut up. I read Reader's Digest like you do. I mean, yeah. She said, well, you do have a big mouth. Shut up. I was saying, you don't let success go to your head, but you don't let failure go to your heart. And that's what's really important about you. Remember that. And she was absolutely right. I have, and I think it's because of my parents, that capacity to say, I'm not going to let failure go to my heart. And I think that has everything to do with how they raised their 8 kids. Because if you were raised in a household where if you made a mistake, you were severely punished for making that mistake and blamed and shamed for making that mistake, chances are you think it's normal to punish, blame, and shame somebody else, even as an adult, when they make a mistake. But if you were raised in a household where you were taught to learn from your mistakes and you were offered love and support through a mistake, then you are predisposed to believe that's what you should offer to other people. So I attribute it to my parents because they raised an unruly set of 8 children and we made big mistakes. And we had a lot of spanking in the middle of it. But at the same time, they never gave up on us. They kept believing in our dreams and they sacrificed mightily to make sure we could have chances to go to college. My parents didn't go to college. My father didn't even graduate high school till he got a GED much later. And so they put a lot of energy into helping us grow up. I don't know how else to put it. Now, Dad, I think he had an advantage. He was a drill sergeant in the Army. So his job was to turn boys into men. And he brought that home, but not in a harsh, punitive way. Dad didn't like to spank. It was Mom that always had to order him to do it. But a college student who was an intern for me this past summer pointed out to me that I probably resemble my dad more than I thought. I said, well, why? She said, you told me about how he turned boys into men. And she said, well, living with you this summer helped me turn from a girl into a woman. And you don't know how much that means to me. I was just doing stuff like reminding her that I wasn't going to tell her more than once to take the trash out. I asked her to take the trash out, and she kind of like stayed on the phone and was playing with TikTok or something. And so I stopped. I said, "How often does your mom have to tell you to take the trash out?" And she said, "Several times." I said, "Remember, I'm not your mom. I'm your landlord. I expect you to do it the first time I ask." You know, just little stuff like that.
I'm so glad that we're talking about raising up children and have your wisdom and the wisdom of your parents. We've got a question about how you can relate this idea or this process of calling in to working with children and families. The person who's written this question says, I'm an early childhood educator, and I'm curious about how to model this idea of calling in for children. So you kind of begun to answer it. How might you call in, also another part of the question, how might you call in families that believe speaking of racial, gender, and identity inclusion is not appropriate for children of young ages? So there's a specific question there too.
Well, there's 2 answers to that question, and I hope I can get them both in without my sieve of a memory making me forget the second one.
I'll help you out with that.
Okay. When I was parenting my son, I was so earnest in trying not to repeat what I thought is my parents' mistakes. So I didn't want to use corporal punishments or spanking or all that stuff. Because, you know, even though it wasn't excessive in my family, I still remember every one of them that happened, kind of thing. And so I didn't want to parent my child that way. But at the same time, coming from the example of my parents, I didn't believe my household was a democracy, that I had adult responsibilities and my child had childhood responsibilities. And I was not confused about how to keep him safe. I had to be the grown up in the situation, not the negotiator kind of thing. And so I learned to exhibit to my child who was in charge, just like I did with that teenager in my house this summer. This is not a negotiation here. This is what you must do, and this is what I will do. And, you know, we're going to work on you staying in your lane and me staying in my lane. And this is what I commit to doing for you. And this is what you're going to commit to doing for me. I try to treat them like little people, you know, little adults, as opposed to infantilizing them. And
Yeah,
that brings me to the second question. Huh?
there's respect in there. You're
Right.
respecting their capacity to respond to the calling in that you're giving them to do what you know they're capable of. And the second question was about for families who think speaking of racial, gender, and identity inclusion is not appropriate for young children.
Well, see, that's again was where I was going, because there's a meme on social media that says that if a 5-year-old Black and brown child can experience racism, then a 5-year-old white child can learn not to replicate it. You know, just think about it. Who are we considering too tender to protect from reality, and why do we consider people children based like that? I was actually hurt by the fact that my parents did not teach me about race and sex as a child in their effort to protect me. Because if I'd known a whole lot more about sex, then my cousin wouldn't have been able to give me liquor to get me drunk in order to have sex with me. And I remember being 8 years old when I first heard the N word. And I was shocked because I had never heard the word. And because I was on a military base at the time, the sins of the children are visited on the fathers in the military. This is how it was in the 1950s. And I say fathers because that's who the majority was in the military. And so I was surrounded by whole communities of white kids that my father outranked. And so they were carefully taught not to say things to me that could get their own daddies in trouble. And so the first time I heard the N word, I was playing with my best friend Debbie. I had snatched a doll from her and she snatched it back. And she said, "You're an N." And I said, "You're an N too," because I didn't know what the word meant. And we went back to playing and everything was fine because that's what kids do. Then at dinner at night, I asked Mom, I said, "Mom, what's an N?" And she went ballistic. "Who said that word to you?" Blah, 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 blah. You would have thought I said the F word. I had said something my mother had worked so hard to keep me from hearing. And I lied because I didn't want to get Debbie in trouble. Because she was my best friend. And then I realized that there was a whole world out there that my parents were lying to me about. And her overreaction told me that word, that world existed. And I became infinitely curious. And so I think it's bad parenting to protect children from reality, actually. That's how I define it. I wouldn't call it child abuse because I got a specific definition for that, but it's definitely bad parenting. Because if you could teach your child to look both ways crossing a street, why would you not teach them about the reality of the world in which they're born in and the way that this world is affecting them? So I get a lot of first-year students coming into my classrooms at Smith College who've been kept racially and sexually innocent, so much so that once I start teaching them about, how the world works and white supremacy and, addressing that racial illiteracy, they get mad at their parents for not telling them this earlier on. They felt like they've been gaslighted by their own parents. That's not a way to send your child off to college. Now making them doubt everything else you told them because of your fear of talking about racial and gender justice. That's not a good parent.
Yeah, it's almost our last 15 minutes together, and there's so much that I would love to be able to hear and to learn from you. One of the things that I wanted to be sure we talked about, and there might be something in this too about what parents do to prepare their children about the real world, and that's to talk about love. You have said that calling in is really calling out with love. So I wanted to give you a couple of really short definitions that others have offered of love, and then hear what yours is. And maybe there's a way that you can tell us how you think parents help children understand what love is. So Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Inhumanity to Man about dehumanization and remaining human in the German concentration camp, said, love is the only way to grasp another human being in their innermost core. And Bell Hooks, who wrote so many things, including All About Love, New Visions, and Black People in Love, defines love as a combination of care, knowledge, responsibility, respect, trust, and commitment. So when you talk about calling in, calling out with love, and when you think about what good parenting would be in preparing children for what is in the real world, alongside all that is hard, tell us how you think about love.
Well, one thing I've learned about love is that people manifest it in such a variety of ways. And so we have to become love literate to often interpret how love shows up in our lives, because the way we want it may not be the way it's offered. And the person offering it is offering it maybe in the way that they know how to offer it and how they'd like to receive it. And so I guess I just coined a term called love literacy, so that you can look at how my father was the ultimate provider, but he didn't know the language of love. But after he'd had 3 different strokes and was blind, and I was doing kind of like my exit interview with him before he died, he reached in his pocket and pulled out $100 bill trying to take care of me, his baby girl, when I made 5 times his retirement income. That's the language of love. And my father never actually uttered the words, I love you. But I knew exactly what language he was speaking in his provider role. My mother was a victim of childhood sexual abuse, so she actually had problems hugging and loving and touching her children because of her trauma. But she was the mother who would have thrown herself in front of a bus without question for any of us. So if I tried to measure my mother's love based on how often she gave me a hug, I would really miss the point. A good friend of mine, when she made her transition from being a man to being a woman, she said that her mother didn't understand a thing that she was going through, but eagerly went through her closet and gave her all of her dresses and hoped that they would fit. And so love literacy is so important so that we can be thankful for the love and how it shows up in our life by letting go of that false expectation that is going to show up in a particular way with particular words, with particular gestures that we romanticize about, but may not receive in the way we want to receive. Now, it always helps to be clear and transparent and say, I need to be loved this way, because, nobody can read your mind. But, and a girlfriend of mine did that. I'll just say one other thing about love. Um, a friend of mine got in bad trouble with her mortgage one day because she became severely disabled. And so she was 3 months behind in her mortgage because she had an operation that paralyzed her from the waist down. And so she was just telling me about it one day. So I said, okay, well, I'll cover your mortgage for you as a gift. That's fine, right? Because I had that disposable income. 4 months later, she called me and she said, sister, do you know what day it is? And I said, yes, Tuesday. She said, no, what date is it? And that's when I remembered that I'd forgotten her birthday. And she said, after 40 years, I don't expect that my best friend would forget my birthday. And we had to have a whole conversation about, well, I kind of show love by giving you 3 months worth of your mortgage. Kind of like my dad, right? As opposed to like my mom remembering that birthday card. And we had to negotiate how we loved on each other. But we loved each other enough to have that hard conversation. But guess what? I ain't never forgot her birthday again. Called it to my attention because I know that's how she wants to be loved.
Because I have to tell you, we began this Learning to Listen series to honor Barry Brazelton, who listened to babies before they had words. And you've given us so much in our thinking about how we need to listen beyond where our own starting points are and what our own expectations or even fantasies might be. So before we go in just the last minute or two, I don't know how to thank you enough for all you've given us in such a short time, so much. But I think we all want to know what we can do for what you really care about. Like, tell us what your call to action is for all of us, and we'll do what we can.
My call to action is do an assessment of your own woulda, coulda, shoulda moment. What are the conversations you wish you had had, the things you should have said, the things you could have said? And wonder for yourself if you could employ a calling in technique next time to get those conversations out of yourself so that you're not full of woulda, coulda, shouldas, but did, and I'm glad I did.
And is that reflecting on all of those woulda, coulda, shouldas, is that part of the healing process that you talk about as being a part of being ready to do the?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I teach this stuff online. Unfortunately, the last class just ended, but I'd invite people to join my mailing list at lorettajross.com so that I can tell you when the next class is. It's only $5 a lecture, and the whole lecture series is 6 lessons and 6 lectures and for $30. So it's kind of like, the Walmart of self-learning kind of thing, because I don't do it because of its profitability. I do it because I'm building a human rights movement based on calling in practices. So I invite people to check out my website and join our mailing list, and we'll let you know when the next online class is offered.
I think a whole bunch of us are going to be there. And you use the word movement, the human rights movement, and I've heard you say this really important thing about what a movement is and what a movement isn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my favorite self-made cliche. And I guess you can plagiarize yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so I've often say to people that when many different people move in the same direction because they think different thoughts, that's a movement. But when many different people move in the same direction and they think one thought, that's a cult. And we're not building a human rights cult. We're building a human rights movement. Our diversity of opinion is our strength, not our weakness. Cults are weak because they only have one thought.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Thank you so much, Professor Ross. I know many of us will be with you for your next classes and for building this movement with you. I just can't thank you enough for the riches of what you've given us in really such a short amount of time. And there are lots of comments asking for more of you, and I'm so glad you were able to share where people can get it. And I hope that we'll be able to bring you back one way or another too. Thank you so much. I want to be sure that you know how grateful we are and how resonant what you shared today is with the thousands of people who have been tuning in. So we will be back again for our final Learning to Listen series for this fall with my friend Hinamoa Elder, who is a Maori child psychiatrist. And she'll be talking to us about Maori wisdom for raising children and families. And then that's December 8th. And then in October, on October 21st and 28th, we will continue on with our Building Culturally Responsive Relationships with Families series. And next week, October 25th, we will have a workshop on how to use a new tool we created for having productive conversations, which is what today has been all about, how to have productive conversations with families about their children's development, especially when there's a difference of opinions or different thoughts about how a child is developing. And then in November, we begin our series on strengths-based family engagement. And that really is also all about coming together to have conversations when we may start from very different places. And then finally, in January, save the date, on January 26th, we will be hosting our first National Substance Use Disorder Summit. And really the focus of that is all about changing the mental models that have kept us stuck with paradigms that are stigmatizing and that exclude the families with lived experience living with substance use who know already exactly what they need to support their healing. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Loretta. Thank you for being with us today. And we will see you all again, we hope, at some of these workshops and for our last Learning to Listen for this fall on December 8th with Dr. Hinamoa Elder. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. Bye-bye, y'all.
Thank you so much. Bye.